External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has called for a stronger cooperation among developing nations and reforms in the global institutions. Speaking in New York on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly soon after Donald Trump lambasted the United Nations, Jaishankar said, very pertinently, multilateralism was under attack.
In face of such proliferation of concerns and multiplicity of risks, it is natural that the Global South would turn to multilateralism for solutions. Unfortunately, there too we are presented with a very disappointing prospect. The very concept of multilateralism is under attack. International organizations are being rendered ineffective or starved of resources. The building blocks of the contemporary order are starting to come apart, and the costs of delaying much-needed reforms is today starkly visible.
The External Affairs Minister's concern is significant since it comes soon after Donald Trump attacked the United Nations. Trump claimed that he had ended 7 unendable wars in the last 7 months without any help from UN. He went on to question the very purpose of UN. Not only is the UN not solving the problems, too often it is actually creating new problems. This is what Donald Trump had to say. United Nations is finding an assault on Western countries and their borders. The UN is supposed to stop invasions, not create them and not finance them. That's what Trump said. Trump also accused UN of funding the migration crisis. Trump's speech at the United Nations leaves no room for confusion. US withdrawal from Paris Agreement, attacks on WHO, and threats to cut UN funding have eroded trust. Trump's disdain for global institutions is a dangerous retreat into unilateralism that threatens to paralyze collective action, maybe creating more space for Beijing consensus as argued by Sanjay Baru.
Had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. And sadly, in all cases, the United Nations did not even try to help in any of them. I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations offering to help in finalizing the deal. All I got from the United Nations was an escalator that on the way up stopped right in the middle. If the First Lady wasn't in great shape, she would have fallen, but she's in great shape. We're both in good shape. We both stood. And then a teleprompter that didn't work. These are the 2 things I got from the United Nations, a bad escalator and a bad teleprompter. I didn't think of it at the time because I was too busy working to save millions of lives. That is the saving and stopping of these wars. But later I realized that the United Nations wasn't there for us. They weren't there. I thought of it really after the fact, not during these negotiations, which were not easy. That being the case, what is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous, tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war.
Let me introduce my guest. I'm joined by Professor Scott Lucas, Professor International Politics, Kilton Institute, University of Dublin. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me. And Professor Swaran Singh, Center for International Studies, JNU. Let me straight away go to Professor Lucas, who joins me from Dublin. Sir, Jaishankar has very clearly said that multilateralism is under stress. Are we witnessing ushering in of the American retreat if we decode the speech of Donald Trump, what he said in UNGA?
When it comes to the Trump administration, it's a combination of a strand that we have had in U.S. history, which could loosely be called American isolationism, that we don't need to work with the world. That was sort of challenged by World War II. And the post-45 period has sort of been an approach to internationalism, but there's still an isolationist strand that's always been in American society. And you combine that with a president who is only in it for himself. So it's not even isolationism, it's Trump for Trumpism. And a group of advisors who quite often, let us be honest here, quite often are xenophobic, quite often are bigoted, including against Indians, by the way. You have all that there. And then you also have, at the same time, a recognition that there are other challenges to multilateralism. The UN does excellent work through its agencies. This is why I was so unsettled by the Trump speech. We could talk about the UN's great work with the environment. We could talk about its work in terms of UNESCO for education, science, cultural initiatives. We could talk about UNICEF for children. We could talk about UN peacekeepers, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the World Health Organization. I could go on and on. But the UN Security Council is effectively paralyzed. And it's paralyzed not because the UN doesn't do great work and not because multilateralism is wrong. It's paralyzed because of individual countries who have veto power. One of them happens to be Russia, which has paralyzed the Security Council over its invasion of Ukraine. One of them is China, which has limited what the Security Council can do in Asian affairs. And one of them is the United States, which has paralyzed the UN over Israel's mass killing in Gaza. So the fundamental problem, as the Indian Foreign Minister pointed out, is not that multilateralism doesn't work, that we need to reinforce it. We need to reinforce it through our own national efforts. We need to reinforce it through regional organizations. And we need to reinforce it in contrast to what Donald Trump did yesterday, not by insulting and demeaning the UN. And by the way, it was his own cameraman that forced that escalator to stop. It wasn't the UN. And we need to actually say, no, that while the UN could be better, it's actually by cooperating with each other that we make it better. It's not by doing it by saying we're going to walk away.
Professor who starts his speech by saying, "What did UN do for me? It gave me a escalator which didn't work properly, and it gave me a teleprompter which is not working properly, and that too from the president of the most powerful country on this earth." Do you expect the most powerful man to say that climate change is a hoax and green energy is going to kill you and it is a sham? No, you don't expect the president of the most powerful country to say this, but he said that and he got away with it. Professor Swaran Singh, do you think that Chinese consensus can replace the Washington consensus, as Professor Lucas was saying, that this is the American retreat? Can that happen? Because power abhors vacuum. And all these multilateral institutions, if America is not there, China can very well fill in those spaces.
I think it defies any logic to see President Trump negating, denouncing, defying international arrangements and institutions that have fundamentally undergirded American global leadership. It surprises me how can someone be so much up against one's own interest in that sense. And of course, as you mentioned, in case there is a vacuum created with President Trump led United States deserting international multilateral arrangements, that vacuum will be filled by others. But whether it is likely to be filled by the Chinese, to some extent, that remains a possibility. But the world today is so much intertwined, interdependent, that perhaps a single power is not likely to replace